going to a different economy, and we're going to be learning more about that as we go. But clearly, we're learning that things can be done from remote locations. We're learning that technology can replace people even more than we thought.
We're not going back to the same economy. We're recovering, but to a different economy, and it'll be one that is more leveraged to technology. And I worry that that is going to make it even more difficult than it was for many workers.
In Silicon Valley, and my friends who work in technology know that what we did to the manufacturing workers, we are now going to do to the retail workers, the call center workers, the fast food workers, the truck drivers, and then even bookkeepers, accountants, insurance agents, lawyers, and on through the economy. So what happened to the manufacturing workers is a very clear sign of what's going to happen.
Welcome to the Crypto Teacher. And guys, I come back with that video just to make you think. Again, we have Jerome Powell, and this one is very important. This video is longer than normal, but it is definitely worth it. Now we have the digital dollar discussed. We know what Jerome is going to say. They're taking their time. But we have the politicians say, look, the digital yuan is way ahead of us. And we know that is done on purpose. We had LIBOR come up. And as we know, a Maribor, which is going to be on the Ethereum blockchain, is going to be the unsecured rate. And also the Fed is going to have SOFR. And guys, you're talking about trillions of dollars in derivative swaps. Now, also, Operation Choke Point came up where the bank, when it comes to this climate change situation, can actually decide who gets funded and not get funded. Now, remember in 2013, I think it supposed to have ended in 2017, but like this congressman stated that it was well alive, where if certain businesses were into payday loans or firearms, they were not able to be funded. And that was a way for the bank to put a stranglehold on them, and that basically caused them to close down. Now we get into the best part of this meeting. Now we know that Janet Yellen's going to take $1 trillion of the general fund and put into the markets. Now remember, I did a video of Steve Mnuchin stating that that money was going to be used to put back for, remember, the payroll deferral. So we're going to see how this plays out. Now, also the March 31st facilities he talked about are very, very important. But the fact is that basically she's going to take a whole $1 trillion and put into the market. We need to find out exactly where that's going to be allocated. Hopefully in the March meeting that we will know something. Just like I stated, we had to keep an eye on Janet Yellen. Now we know what she's going to do. Yes, those facilities may be closing, but she's putting $1 trillion in the market, which means what? The market is going to have even more liquidity. So that means that certain stocks are going to go up. And then also crypto should definitely benefit. So like I stated in all my videos, I'm going to wait to see what she does. And now we see that what she's doing, but we still have to see exactly where it's going to be allocated. Plus we have the stimulus package is going to be passed. But we know a lot of that is baked into the EV stocks already. Now, we also heard from the politician advising that the Fed is destroying the U.S. dollar, which we already know. They want to destroy this current economy to get us moved over. All this is intentionally done. They're printing all this money to fund the fourth industrial revolution. And in all these meetings, guys, the fourth industrial revolution never comes up. Yes, we have, of course, Jerome, I play the video all the time, say, oh, this old economy is gone. But a normal person who's actually listening to us is not going to know what that means. We know what it means, but the masses have no idea. And then lastly, guys, Jerome states that they have research on how a child being out of school for a whole year affects them. So like I state, guys, all this is a test. They have research, and we already know what that research is going to be. It's going to be negative. Because if you think about all the kids who have parents, which is great, whether you have a mom, dad, or both, that's wonderful you have parents. But what you have to understand is the kids that don't have parents. Remember, school was that 8 hours, 9 hours, 10 hours, however long they stay in school, was that time for them to leave the home and get into that better environment. Not only the environment, but also get a decent meal. We know how bad the world is. Federal Reserve knows how bad the world is. So the politicians know how bad this world is. So just imagine if you can take a screenshot of last year of all these kids being out of school and then plus the beginning of this year, how it's going to affect them and even getting back into school and how they're going to react. Just like I stated, guys, the Federal Reserve, the politicians, and if you have common sense, we know everybody does not have a parent. And there's a lot of bad parents out there. And the fact is that school was a time for them to change their lives. You hear so many stories of kids going to Boys and Girls Club, of doing special activities after school so they didn't have to worry about going home. So now you've had kids sit in a house where a lot of times they shouldn't even be at in the first place. They had no choice but just to be there. So that's definitely disturbing news. But guys, when it comes to the New World Order, everything is planned out. Enjoy the video.
National security issue and economic security issue for sure. You said you're committed to transparency as you look into the digital dollar. I think that's important. I think that's very important for our system of government. I think it's a very important thing for an open society. But let's get into a few specifics on that if we can. What can the public expect in terms of learning the details of this project going forward? And are some more details, are you able to share with us today what we can expect from the Fed in this year, over the course of this year with the digital dollar project?
Yeah, so this is going to be an important year, and this is going to be the year in which we engage with the public pretty actively, including some public events that we're working at, which I'm not going to announce today, but there are things that we're working on. And it's the sense of this is not, here are the decisions we've made, what do you guys think? It's going to be, these are the trade-offs, they're both policy questions and there are technical questions that interrelate between those two, and they're very challenging questions, and so we're going to want to have a public dialogue about that with all of the interested constituencies, and that is the idea of what we're doing. In the meantime, we're working on the technical challenges and also collaborating with and sharing work with the other central banks around the world who are doing this. And we will need, depending on what we do, we could well need legislative authorization for such a thing. That isn't clear until we see which way we're going. But so we will be engaging significantly with you and your colleagues on Capitol Hill as well.
Okay. So I think the project's vital. I think it's vital for American competitiveness. But I also, there's a fear that some want to use the digital dollar as a way to kill private sector innovation and our banking system. Implementing modern monetary policy, modern monetary theory, for example, vis-a-vis Fed accounts. What do you say to folks hoping to exploit the digital dollar project in that way?
Well, one thing we need to be very mindful about is that we have a functioning financial system and a banking system and capital markets which intermediate between savers and borrowers, and they're the best markets and I would say the strongest banks in the world. We need to be careful with our design of the digital dollar that we don't create something that will undermine that very healthy market-based function. That's one thing,
okay,
for sure.
Understood. Chairman Powell, yesterday you mentioned that the digital dollar, it's a high priority project for the Fed. I appreciate that, but you also went on to mention that the Fed is more focused on getting it done right rather than getting it done fast. So getting it done right, especially for a project like this, we can all appreciate that. Now I know, that the U.S. dollar is the reserve currency of the world, and I think we hope that doesn't change anytime soon. But with that being said, a lot of other countries are just leaps and bounds ahead of us when it comes to digital currency. A couple of them, I think of the digital yuan, Sweden's e-krona, also in Ukraine, and even in Uruguay in the e-peso. Is there any worry that the U.S. is falling way behind the rest of the world in the development of a CBDC? And does this staggered start, do you think that puts the U.S. at a disadvantage?
No, I don't. We are the reserve currency of the world, and that is because of our great democratic institutions, our vibrant economy, and just that we are the incumbent, and we have relatively low inflation. The value of the dollar has been relatively stable for some years now, and so I think we will be that. I think it's a very, very important decision that we make, and there are potential pitfalls. There are issues around privacy and how you structure it, and it would be to do it as quickly as possible and get it wrong would be a very bad idea. So we're going to be careful. I do think that we have the time to think this through carefully. I'm not concerned that other countries are experimenting with this. But I have to say, it's possible now. Technology has made it possible, and it's happening, and the private sector is doing it too. So we understand that we need to be in a position of really understanding it and doing it if it's the right thing for Americans.
Will continue to be published until June of 2023. It's almost disappointing to get a reprieve, and that it will reduce the pressure on us to actually solve this problem. But it does give us more time. And there is, of course, the Alternative Reference Rates Committee, ARC, and we have legislation to facilitate how to deal with what will be $2 trillion of existing contracts that don't have backup language. I wonder if you can confirm for me, in your view, is it necessary to have federal legislation to have a smooth transition after June 2023 when LIBOR is no longer published?
Yes, we think it will be. As you know, many LIBOR contracts are going to run off before then, but there'll be a hard tail, as we say, and we do think federal legislation is the best answer.
And there are those who think that that the private sector can just invent a synthetic LIBOR and that would solve the problem. Is that as good a solution as federal legislation?
No, federal legislation creating a path for a backup would be the best solution, we think.
Here with regards to the greening of the banking system, and I think my good friend Congressman Barr of Kentucky and I, he headlined a letter to the Fed, and I was one of other 45 members who signed on to it with regards to the Fed's including climate stuff into their stress tests. And while I understand the need for that to an extent, it certainly is concerning. It raises some flags for me from the standpoint that in an article here, it was talking, excuse me, a gentleman by the name of Ike Brannon, who's an economist and president of Capital Policy Analytics. He was talking about the stress test, and he said that it's a long-term goal of many who advocated that the Fed take this step. But he says, I think they have designs that go beyond climate change. Creating a system whereby the government can use its financial regulatory power to direct the economy away from businesses and industries it disapproves of is very much a goal of many Democrats in Congress and administration. Mr. Chairman, that sounds an awful lot like Choke Point to me. Operation Choke Point was something that we put the dagger in the heart of several years ago, and to resurrect that, to use climate change as an excuse to go after businesses who are doing legal business in a legal way, producing products and services we need as an economy is wrong. And I'm just wondering where you stand on that. Mr. Chairman.
Sorry. First, let me say that the climate stress scenarios are completely different from the stress tests. It's not the same thing at all. But you really asked about a different question. Sorry, which was just in 2 seconds. What was the question you did ask?
Well, basically, it's about whether you're weaponizing the regulatory system to do choke point stuff again. If on business, on banks that do not necessarily comply with what your climate agenda may be.
So we're not climate policy makers. Climate policy makers are democratically elected people, and those they delegate that authority to. So we're not thinking of it that way. We, as you know, as an institution, we've had a long-held reluctance, resistance, and unwillingness, really, to engage in the allocation of credit. We think that is for the private sector, and if Congress wants to allocate credit in particular ways, that's fine. We don't want to get involved in that, and it's not something we're looking to do. What we're doing is well, go ahead. I'll let you go ahead.
Well, I would just make the point that we found during the Obama-Biden administration that Operation Choke Point was alive and well. It was instituted by them. It was carried out by them, and we tried to get rid of it during this past administration. So it's something that's there. It's something that we talked about a lot. But let me move on.
In the United States could have harmful effects on U.S. banks and the businesses they serve. Our letter asks that you not import any NGFS standards that would harm the financial system or U.S. businesses, and in your response, you committed to this. How do you plan to evaluate NGFS proposals through the lens of upholding this commitment?
Well, as I said in the letter, as my colleague and I said in the letter, we're not going to import anything into the United States that we don't think is appropriate for the betterment and support and safety and soundness of the U.S. financial system. But we're actually at a much earlier stage than any that conversation would suggest. We're really engaged in outreach and in thinking about frameworks. We're talking to these institutions. We're talking to supervisory institutions here in the United States and around the world. So we're at an earlier stage than.
Well,
I suggest.
And that's good to hear, but I do worry that injecting climate risk scenarios into stress tests could perpetuate the trend of debanking legally operating businesses like fossil fuels. In your letter, you commit that the Fed will not dictate what lawful industries regulated firms can serve. Even without a directive from the Fed, climate scenarios and stress tests may compel firms to debank certain industries to satisfy the spirit of the tests. My comment here is that limiting capital allocation to specific industries may itself have implications on financial stability and economic growth through lost jobs, higher energy prices, and compromised energy security. And final point here, I would like the Fed to keep in mind that choking off capital to fossil energy will not only produce the kind of reliability challenges we saw last week in Texas, it will undermine the Fed's maximum employment mandate. Final question on inflation. Yesterday, you said you weren't concerned about the threat of inflation, but some of the economic indicators are blinking warning lights for me. High asset prices, rapidly rising bond yields, elevated commodity prices, historically high year-over-year increase in the money supply as measured by M2. And these are on top of the unprecedented monetary and fiscal stimulus enacted last year and the $2 trillion fiscal blowout this week. Within the bounds of the Fed's new monetary policy framework for a long-term running average target for inflation, how high are you willing to let inflation get, and for how long before you step in?
We don't have a formula in mind. I would just say that, as I've said earlier, we do expect inflation to move up, both because of some sort of technical calculation reasons called base effects, but also because we'll have a surge in spending perhaps later this year. We don't expect that will be particularly large, or even more, that it will be persistent, because it's in the nature of a one-time thing. Whereas inflation is a process that gets going over a period of years, and we don't think, and we're committed to the idea that it will not become a persistent thing. It is ultimately the credibility of the Fed and our commitment to a price stability mandate that holds inflation where it is. We haven't changed it.
It has purchased more than $1.8 trillion of U.S. Treasury securities. And last week, you reiterated, as you did yesterday in the Senate, that the Fed remains patiently accommodative in its monetary policy position. But this extraordinary amount of accommodation is now coupled with the decision that the Treasury has recently announced, Chair Yellen, that they are planning on drawing down their cash account they hold at the Fed by almost $1 trillion, which would inject that directly into the economy. My question, Chairman Powell, is, has Secretary Yellen discussed with you drawing down the Treasury account?
As a matter of long practice, I don't discuss my private conversations with elected representatives or with the Treasury Secretary. But of course, we're well aware. There's an ongoing staff level dialogue, about between Treasury and the Fed and the New York Fed about the Treasury General account and what the plans are for that. So we're well aware of it.
If $1 trillion was drawn out of that account and injected, do you think that could cause short-term interest rates, something you're very concerned about at the Board of Governors and a very keen focus on monetary policy, could that cause short-term rates to go negative?
So it could put downward pressure on short-term rates. Of course, our principal concern is that the federal funds rate be within the range that the FOMC has ordered it to be. And we have the tools to make sure that that's the case. And if that is the case, and it will be the case, that we'll be within our range, we'll be where we need to be. That's going to tend to work against the other, short-term money market rates going too low.
Yeah. No, it's a key point. That's why I'm concerned about that impact in the market, understanding it. I mean, for example, I assume the Board of Governors, from a monetary policy reaction to that, if short-term rates went negative, is you could raise the rates on the IOER range that you have. Would that be a tool that you could take into effect?
Yes, we haven't made any decisions about this at all, but of course that and also the rate on the reverse repo facility are the two things that we can move. And those are our two administered rates. And so those would be the tools that we can use, among others, frankly. But those are things that we can do.
Well, certainly in light of what Ann Wagner asked about a few minutes ago on the supplemental leverage ratio, these things kind of come together in the banking system, and managing those expectations, either the level of short-term rates or the dislocation in rates and the Fed's reaction to it, or that kind of cash coming out into the banking system and thus aggravating that supplemental leverage ratio. These are important issues, and I would encourage the board to consider action sooner rather than later because of that March 31 date.
A strong dollar that has become the world's reserve currency. It does great things for our capital markets and, frankly, helps enable the deficit spending that we've continued to do. Because we certainly haven't saved for bad times. We're able to navigate them because we still can borrow. I wonder, sir, do you have a definition of sound money?
We target inflation that averages 2% over time. That is what we consider to be.
Well, that's a policy, but I mean, when you think of sound money, what would you say constitutes sound money?
Well, the public has confidence in the currency, which they do, which the world does. That's really what it comes down to, that people believe that the United States currency is perfectly reliable and stable in value.
Okay, so as a store of value, it clearly isn't stable in value. It is not. But as a store of value, the U.S. dollar really, is it diluted as a store of value when M2 goes up by more than 25% in 1 year? Does the printing of more U.S. dollars somehow diminish the value of the dollars that others hold?
There was a time when monetary aggregates were important determinants of inflation, and that has not been the case for a long time. So you'll see, if you look back, the correlation between movements in different aggregates, you mentioned M2, and inflation is just very, very low. And you see that now, where inflation is at 1.4% for this year.
You keep using that, and you keep using it to talk about inflation. And I don't think that's the only proxy for whether the dollar is a store of value and an efficient means of exchange. It is clearly still the world's reserve currency, but we're putting it under a pretty big stress test by diluting the value of the dollars. And I think one of the indicators of that is when the U.S. government issues debt, all this spending that we've done as a country, it isn't really funded, is it? I mean, there's not a true market demand for this much debt. It's not being lent. When there's borrowing, there's actually a lender. How much has the Federal Reserve had to purchase to bridge the gap between market demand for treasuries and the actual need to finance the spending?
That's not at all what's happening. We don't have to purchase any of this. We purchase it because it is providing accommodative financial conditions and supporting the economy in keeping with our mandate. There's plenty of demand for U.S. Treasury paper around the world.
So all of it would sell. You're competing. So are you bidding up the price then? Is it your contention that you're inflating asset prices by increasing this purchase?
No, I think that we could sell all of our debt. That's the reason we do it. But by the way, we issue debt when we issue United States obligations in the form of reserves when we buy treasuries. So we're not actually changing the amount of obligations outstanding on the part of the treasury. What we're doing is we're substituting an overnight reserve for a treasury bill. It has no effect on the overall outstanding obligations of the United States when we do that.
Right. So the growth of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, you don't think that has anything to do with the disconnect between Wall Street and Main Street? Or let's just take as an example the confidence people have expressed in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, and well-respected, proven investors like Ray Dalio, who said cash is trash. Isn't it because the U.S. dollar is being destroyed by fiscal and monetary policy?
It's hard to say that it's being destroyed. I mean, that if you look at, so another way to look at the dollar, if you mentioned the dollar, you can ask domestically what can it purchase, and that's a question of inflation. You can also look at in terms of a basket of other currencies. And
yes, I understand, but if you look at it, sir,
the dollar is in
time. The key to this is the Fed has done a horrible job at predicting asset bubbles. They have. And if the pensions are going up because the market prices are going up, people with marketable securities have their basket of wealth going up and wages aren't. Current consumption, teachers, for example, they have a great pension, but their current consumption isn't going up. So CPI lags what's going on in the investment. I think it's a big concern, and I would just implore you and the other members of the Fed to pay attention to monetary inflation, not just consumer prices.
We know all the concerns that parents have, that students have, that teachers have, that educators have. I do want to ask you though, has the Federal Reserve done any analysis on what school closures have done to employment in the United States? Is there any data on that?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of data on that, and there's also research that people are doing that tries to quantify. Very difficult to do this with confidence, but tries to quantify the burden that kids who miss a year of in-person schooling will bear through their economic lives and the effect that'll have on the economy. So there's a lot of data and a lot of research. If you have something specific, we'll be happy to find that for you.